Today I'm comparing the Lanshan 2 with the new Naturehike Summiture UL tent. So these are both budget 2-person trekking pole tents. Now I've already weighed these tents and I've weighed them as the tent, body and fly in their stuff sacks only. The Summiture 2 does have 2 small poles which are required to put the tent up. I have weighed it with those, but no pegs and no ground sheets. Both tents do include pegs, but only the Summiture includes a ground sheet. The Lanshan generally doesn't come with one. The reason I weigh them like this is because I usually use my own pegs, not the ones that come with any tents. And I often don't use the mat that comes with the tent. Also, I think it makes for a fairer comparison. Some tents come with 15 heavy duty pegs and then other tents only come with 6 ultralight pegs. And that can be, over 100 grams of difference. The Lanshan weighed 1,050 grams. And the Summiture weighed 1,100 grams, so 50 grams more for the Summiture than the Lanshan. First of all, I'm going to go with how easy they are to pitch and any differences between them there, and I'm going to start with the Summiture. So right off the bat, on the Summiture, you need 10 pegs to get a basic pitch. And that's just what you see here. There's no extra guy lines being put out. There's even a few places where I've omitted pegs that could have used them. And that's compared to the Lanshan, which can basically go up quite well with 6 pegs. Now this might cause a bit of drama if you're trying to put the tent up somewhere where you can't get good stake holds. I've used the Lanshan in deep sand, and it was quite easy just with 6 pegs and 6 large stones on top of each peg, and it held up all night. Don't get me wrong, you can do exactly the same thing with the Summiture. You'll just have to use more rocks, more pegs, but it can be done nonetheless. Now a difference here at the doors / vestibule is they are pegged independently of the ridgeline. So that's slightly different to the standard setup on the Lanshan 2, which they are pegged together. So this line continues all the way around and it pegs the doors and the ridgeline in one peg. However, something I'll talk about after is the mods on the Lanshan 2, which are really common, and one of them is actually splitting that into 2. So again, maybe for now it's just a difference, not a plus or a minus. On both these tents, I have the pole set at 125 centimeters, as recommended by the manufacturers, and it seems to provide the right tension for the body of the tent. So an oddity with the Summiture versus the Lanshan is it has these poles, one either end of the tent. And that is designed supposedly to bring more headroom and foot room into the top and bottom of the tent. Another difference between the Lanshan and the Summiture is the Summiture does not have an adjustable gap between the bathtub floor, which is here, and the fly sheet, which is here. They're only linked via hook and loop. So when you peg the fly and tension the fly, it automatically tensions the bathtub. But it means there's no adjustability there. So you can't raise the poles to have a higher fly sheet away from the ground because you can't independently peg out the body of the tent. There is also very minimal adjustment on the fly. So you've only got a few centimeters of cordage to have any extra room, whether you want it tighter or looser. Both tents are very similar with pole supports. So there's a reinforced section at the top of the tent with a loop where you pass the handle of your trekking pole through. And there's also a loop down the bottom here where you pass the foot of your trekking pole. Just quickly before I move away from the setup of the Summiture 2, I've readjusted the poles inside to 130 centimeters and I've pegged out the bottom of those poles. So that's now bringing it up to 12 pegs to set it up. But it is a slightly tauter pitch now and it does look a lot better than it did. So although it says 125 centimeters, 130 seems to suit it a lot better. Now onto the setup of the Lanshan. Now I've only set this up with 6 pegs, the 4 corners and a guy out each side. There is a large online community of people modifying these Lanshans with loads of different ideas of changing these guy out points so that you guy them independently, of adding bungee cord to the bathtub floor, of using a second set of trekking poles or sticks to kind of mimic what the Summiture does with the guy out points at the end. But for today, I'm just using it exactly as it comes out of the bag. Now this is how the Lanshan looks when you set it up with 125 centimeter poles. You just peg out the bathtub square and then you go around and tighten the fly up until it's taut. And this leaves a good gap all the way around the tent and a larger gap at the two sides where the vestibules are. Now there are loads of options for lowering the tent poles, adjusting the tension on the bathtub floor, changing these guy out points on the doors so that you can actually guy it out further down here with a lowered pole, which is really good if you want to use this in a variety of situations and you're willing to get a little bit geeky. Go and watch all of the YouTube videos and learn loads of different bits about what might work for you and what might not on this tent. But you can still use it exactly as it is. And it's still a really good tent. I have over 100 nights on this tent and I've not modified it at all, other than I have a freestanding kit modification that I've made. There's another video on my YouTube so that I can use it without trekking poles. So a difference in each corner is the way the fly and the body of the tent are pegged out. So I'll just untension the fly. And now you can see that although the fly and the body are connected, it's much further up. And when it's pulled, it's to add extra height to the bathtub floor. So on the Naturehike, it's way down here and it provides all of the tension for the bathtub floor. So the bathtub floor on the Lanshan can also be tensioned by adjusting the length of this cord. It actually has a slip knot here, but I've always found it adequate for me just to pull it out taut, the bathtub floor, and then slip over the fly, tension the fly, and you're away. I just quickly want to go over the way the doors are pegged out differently on the Lanshan to the Summiture. So on the Lanshan, this one line connects both the tension point for the ridge line of the tent and the doors. So to use the doors, you unhook one of them from this little clip here. And now you can use the door and the ridge line remains tensioned. You can also still unhook the other door, roll both up, and the ridge line is still tensioned. Okay, now I've got the doors rolled open on both tents and I'm going to go over the inners of the tents. And crucially, I'm going to go over the interior space and we'll find out if those extender poles make a difference or not. Okay, I'm just going to start with the doors for now. This Summiture comes with a T-shaped door. It's one zip up the middle and two either side, so you can open the inner of the tent completely. Now this is almost a point to the Summiture because the Lanshan which I have is actually an older one which has the J-shaped door which only opens on one side. But now you can choose to have the Lanshan with either the J-shaped door or the T-shaped door. So this is the J-shaped door on the Lanshan. It's just one zip all the way around from the bottom to the top. And you can roll it back like that. So you can't open the full side of the tent as you can on the Summiture. However, you do have the choice of which inner that you get with a Lanshan. I think most of the new ones ship by default with the T shape, not with the J. A reason you might want the J is it's fewer moving parts to go wrong. So it's just the one zip as opposed to three zips which meet in the middle. Me personally, I've been quite happy with this J-shaped door. Okay, now I'm going to do interior space. Now, it's going to be quite difficult to quantify the different sizes of these tents because the inner dimensions of the Summiture are pitched into a different point rather than the Lanshan, which is just a very simple flat teepee. However, what I can say right away is the floor on the Summiture is nearly 100 millimeters shorter than the Lanshan. The Lanshan is 2150 and this is just under 2100, more like 2070. However, it's 100 mil wider on the Summiture than it is on the Lanshan. The Lanshan is 1100 and the Summiture is 1200. Okay, so I've got my sleeping pad in here. It's a 25-inch wide Big Agnes Rapide and it's also about 100 mil deep. So I think I found a way to measure whether there's any actual difference in usable head height between the two. This pad is exactly central in the tent, front to back, and I'm measuring from the second weld in the middle of the pad. So that's exactly 400 mil. There's actually 50 mil less headroom in the Summiture than there is in the Lanshan. Now I'm not too surprised at that because of the way the tent pitches on the inside. There might be more headroom, but only in a very specific spot. Now I have managed to find a guy out rope for the Lanshan just on the one side to add that headroom. Now, something which I have just realized about the Lanshan is using this really wide rectangle Big Agnes pad, there isn't room for 2 wide pads in here. These are 600 wide and this is only 1100. So I'm sure it would squeeze in, but on paper, this only fits 1 wide and 1 regular. In saying that, this is 25 inches wide and it's rectangular, so it is an abnormally large pad. When I measure from the same point in the pad to where it hits the roof, it's roughly 500 millimeters. Whereas on the Summiture, it was more like 400 and a little bit. Now, I think the reason is because the bathtub floor on the Naturehike stays relatively flat in the corners. And the only extra headroom it gets is from those poles. However, the bathtub on the Lanshan is first pegged out in the corners and then raised by the clip on the fly of the tent. So it gives this square, boxy bathtub floor, which raises it 180 millimeters right off the bat. So actually for internal space, it's a little bit of a strange one. I think I would take the headroom of the Lanshan with its simplicity over having the extra width, even though I do like having a wide pad. So this mat is right in the middle. I'm going to do a quick sitting down, sitting up test. My head doesn't touch at all. So I have plenty of room above my head and I don't touch anywhere when I sit up. And I'm more or less where I would be if I was sleeping in the tent. And a quick lying down and sitting up test in the Summiture. Above my head, there's not that much room. And if I do sit up, I'm fairly well contacting the mesh. The headroom, which you would expect to gain from those extra poles, is negated by the shape of the tent. So I'm just quickly going to go over some features of the inners that might be different other than the size. They're both more or less completely mesh. The Summiture is mesh all the way around at the same height of about 3 or 4 inches, whereas the Lanshan has a solid panel which goes around the head and the foot and comes up to about halfway. So perhaps stops a little bit of cold wind coming in at your head and your feet. Good if you're camped somewhere cold, perhaps not if you're camped somewhere really hot. They both have a little pocket. The Summiture has 2 pockets, Lanshan only has 1. They're both very small, they're both pretty needless. They both have a hook in the roof, but where the Summiture has really messed up is it only has 1 hook, whereas the Lanshan has 2. And why that makes a difference is if you want to have a clothesline, so you have 1 cord passing from 1 hook to the other so that you can hang wet clothes to dry at night, then you can't do it because you don't have another point to anchor your line. Now, there aren't many reviews of the Summiture online, but the one in-depth one that I have watched does criticize the zips and say that they failed on the first night. I haven't used this tent overnight. Actually, I don't plan on doing so, but these zips do sound horrible. Yeah, I wouldn't trust those for too long, to be honest. They feel like they're dragging, they sound like they're dragging. Also, the bathtub floor in the Summiture raises up at each end where those poles lift it. And where it's attached to the fly at that point is with a bungee. So it actually kind of banana shapes the interior of the tent. It's quite strange. I don't know if it would settle down with time, but it is a little unnerving to see that most of your tent floor has been lifted off the ground. And there's nothing that you can adjust to get rid of that. So to the features and quality of the inner on the Lanshan, as you can see, the bathtub floor raises up as it gets towards the head and the tail end and becomes a solid panel for around your head and around your feet. Again, great for cold, maybe not so great for hot weather, but still most of this is entirely mesh. It only has 1 small pocket on one end, but it does have 2 hooks, 1 either end, so you can attach a washing line if you want to. Again, apologies, as the J-type door, you can get a J and a T-type, but the zips feel really nice. And I've never had any issues with mine. I've owned this and the Pro version, and I've got a lot of trail miles on them. Like I said, I've never had any problems with them. I've used this tent a lot and I've not used the Summiture overnight. So I don't want to damn it for something that I'm not 100% sure of, but they don't feel good on the Summiture and they do feel fine on this. Now I'm going to go over the features of the fly sheets and the size and usability of the vestibules. The Summiture pegs out extremely close to the ground all the way around. And you can't change that. You can't raise the height of the pole to give you any more room under there, especially with this pole here, which pushes it down to the ground it's touching. With the Lanshan, you can raise the height of the pole. You have loads of adjustability on the fly. You can have it all the way up here if you want. You could lower the pole and then cinch this right down to the ground if you also wanted. So if you're somewhere really cold, snow camping, and you wanted to keep all of the cold wind out, you can pitch this so that it's nearly on the floor. If you were in the Summiture and you were somewhere, for example, where there's going to be a lot of condensation, you're pretty much stuck with having this with the fly sheet almost touching the floor all the way around. It's going to be soaked in there. And in hot weather, you could raise the poles on the Lanshan and adjust the fly to have a huge gap all the way around, and you get loads of airflow right through. Also great for condensation. There'll be more chance of a breeze so that it won't trap all that moisture. One thing it does mean is that the Summiture is less fiddly to put up because there's not much that you can adjust on it. You have to put it out the way that it is. And with the Lanshan, sometimes it takes a little bit of learning to get the pitch how you want it. It can be frustrating at the start, if I'm honest. I didn't realize that there were so many different ways that you could pitch the tent. I thought there was the right way and the wrong way, and I sometimes couldn't find exactly the right way. Now with time, I know there's just lots of different ways to do it. In saying that, this has got 12 pegs in it right now just to hold it up, and this only has 6 and the 1 guy rope. The vestibule space is extremely similar on both tents. To be honest, there's not much that separates them vestibule wise, except that obviously the Naturehike is fixed height, and the Lanshan, you can have it much higher, much lower, depending on how you pitch the fly and how you peg out the door. They're both a really great size, and no complaints with either of the vestibules. Lanshan awning, very similar. This door is pitched quite high at the moment because I've got the fly pitched quite high, but I could lower the poles and bring this down. I could also disconnect this clip and peg this down lower or use a piece of cord. Now to my final thoughts on these two tents. I just want to preface this by saying that I love Naturehike tents. Generally, most of my tents for the last few years have been Naturehike. However, my pick is going to be the Lanshan. The reason being, for one, those poles which should add extra headroom on this Naturehike, they don't really add extra headroom, but they do make the pitch more complicated. Also, the fly is extremely difficult to lift and get any airflow at all. So for the most part, it's almost touching the ground all the way around. If it's hot, it's going to be stuffy inside. If it's cold, there's going to be a lot of condensation, and there's just no adjustability here. And also to the quality of the zips on the body, they do feel bad. They do feel like they're not going to last. I don't know that for sure. There's some reports on the internet that suggest that is true. I would believe them. And onto the Lanshan, yes, it can be more difficult to pitch. Yes, there are a lot more options. There are a lot of different heights that you can play with. There are a lot of different tensions. There are a lot of modifications online that can be improvements to you or hindrances, depending on how you look at it. But you can use it as it is straight out the box and ignore all of those things. It's a great tent. I've never had any problems with mine. I've had multiples of them. I've had the Pro version. I would recommend it to anybody who wants a trekking pole tent and understands that a trekking pole tent is always going to be more fiddly to put up than a freestanding tent. If you're looking for your first trekking pole tent, just know that whichever one you go for, it's going to be a slight learning curve, how to get that good pitch. Uneven ground can be a little bit difficult sometimes, or when you can't get the pegs in well, and that's going to be the same for either of these. But still, there's a lot of videos online on how to get a better pitch on your non-freestanding tent, and especially with the Lanshan, there's loads of support out there. Okay, thank you very much for watching. I hope somebody found that helpful. My next video is going to be another 3F UL versus Naturehike. So I've got the new Star Trail 1 EXT, the Lanshan one, normal. And this is going to be a sub $200 ultralight tent test for one person. Bye.